Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams. Good morning to you, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning. Good to be on with you.
Thank you. You have said that somewhere around 70% of hospital beds in your city are currently occupied. Are the hospitals close to being overwhelmed?
No, not at all. My daily briefings with my healthcare professionals, had one earlier today. They stated that we are stable and they're doing an amazing job. And those heroes and sheroes who are the nurses and doctors and hospital employees, we just need to really commend them for the job. And we're watching this closely, and we're going to make sure we respond and pivot as COVID continues to do so.
Well, we wish you luck with that. You have the largest school district in the country in your city, of course, and you have been very clear you are keeping schools open. To do that, you've given out N95 masks, required staff be vaccinated. Everyone's got to be masked. You've got air purifiers, you've routine screening, but you're not requiring a negative test before students return to the classroom. That's something they're doing here in the District of Columbia. Are you confident you can keep the level of transmission low?
And it's so important that you laid out the things that we put in place, because COVID is a formidable and moving target. And we have to pivot and shift based on that. And our policies have been rooted in, I need my children in school. And if my medical professionals tell me, Eric, we have to do a mandated vaccine, we're going to do that. But right now, we have brought over 1.5 million tests in our schools, as you indicated, N95 masks, as well as other resources and tools. And we have been doing an amazing job because of one thing, coordination and communication with our UFT and other agencies involved. And I believe we're doing the right thing for our children, having them in the safest place, and that is in the school building.
That UFT, you're talking about the union there, but you've kept schools open, but the plain fact of the matter is people are still going to get sick. And I know you have had some staff shortages as a result of that. Attendance in school this past week was about 70%, so about 300,000 out of 1 million students missed class. Are you going to have to elongate the school year to make up for all this?
I'm so glad you said that, because I think many people are missing. There was an amazing article in the New York Times that stated this is the first time we spent more time and energy around protecting adults than the future of our children. I'm troubled that we almost had a 2-year loss for our children. They're behind in math, behind in English. We're going to sit down with my new chancellor and stated, how do we start doing the catch up? Because remote options are not really being used and can't be used correctly for those children who don't have access to high-speed broadband, need the meals that they need. I know we have to look at a different way of living with COVID each time a new variant comes out, and one area is education.
But you do have these staffing shortages, as many schools are seeing around the country. The federal government says they're giving out plenty of money for you to hire people to come in. But how do you get someone to take a job as a teacher right now in the middle of a pandemic at a low wage?
Well, we need them in, and our teachers are paid accordingly to a great union contract, and they get the support that they deserve. And we need to attract people to do what I like to say, teaching is a calling. We're not just trying to make sure we fill a job applicant. No, we want the best in front of our children.
Right.
And what we have done successfully here in the city is pivot and shift based on the needs and how COVID is changing. We must learn to live with COVID, and we have to do it in a safe way.
Well, we may have to live with it, but for the infection rate, when I look at the New York State Department of Health report, which I just did, it said potential increased severity of the Omicron variant may also play a role in increased rate of hospitalizations for children under age 11. What makes you confident that Omicron isn't causing bad outcomes in kids when the state makes this point?
Well, let's look at something else the state and city is stating. A child is 4 times more likely to be hospitalized if they're not vaccinated. So I am saying to my parents and the people of New York, get vaccinated and get booster shots. we don't have to feel helpless like the beginning of this virus in 2020. Science and global communities came together. We now have the tools that we need. So let's empower ourselves with the vaccination and booster shots.
Right.
If we do that, we will bring down those hospital rates. And that is what I'm encouraging parents to do.
But some parents are just not vaccinating their 5 to 11-year-olds, that younger demographic. But what about kids who are 4 and under? They don't have an option to take a vaccine, and that is where you're seeing the fastest growing infection rate, according to the New York State Department of Health. Are you going to keep daycare facilities open? Or are you going to keep preschools open when those kids can't be vaccinated?
Yes, we are. We're going to continue to do what we're doing, coordinating with our healthcare professionals. When you start to disrupt the stability of childcare, of daycare and education, it has a rippling impact throughout our entire city. Parents can't keep their children home. They have to work. The economy is also part of this crisis that we're facing. And with the proper balance of creating a safe environment inside our daycares, our schools and other locations, our parents can go and do the jobs they need to do. And that is what I must face in the city. We have to ensure the financial ecosystem is healthy, as well as our children and our families are healthy at the same time.
Mr. Mayor, we'll be watching. Thank you for your time this morning. Around the world, we have reached another milestone. There have now been more than 300 million reported infections since the pandemic began. Our Elizabeth Palmer reports from Bangkok.
Good morning. The Beijing Winter Olympic Games are going to start in less than a month now, and China is desperately trying to keep COVID at bay, but the outbreaks haven't stopped.
Most recently in Tianjin, commuting distance from Beijing. An army of healthcare workers are testing the city's 14 million residents after 2 Omicron cases were confirmed. In the northern city of Jian, state media showed government food deliveries to some of the 13 million citizens in lockdown since December 23rd. Other heavy-handed tactics include welding shut the doors of anyone suspected of having been exposed to the virus. In Serbia, there were demonstrations in support of the world's top-ranked tennis player and native son, Novak Djokovic. His visa was cancelled when he arrived unvaccinated in Melbourne for the Australian Open. He's now grounded in this hotel. Some tennis fans and most anti-vaxxers are furious as an Australian court prepares to decide whether he'll be allowed to play or be sent home. Finally, Omicron is surging in Europe, with more than 300,000 new cases yesterday in France alone. In Britain, hospitals are at capacity.
It's all looking very good.
But there are, at last, very early signs that the surge has peaked, at least in London. While Israel is now offering a second booster, that is, a 4th vaccination, to the vulnerable.
Consider vaccine inequality, though. The world's richest countries have now given more booster shots alone than all the vaccines administered by the world's poorest countries put together. Margaret?
Elizabeth Palmer, thank you. We'll be right back. Since the 2020 elections, Georgia has become ground zero in the fight over election integrity. The state's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, joins us now from Atlanta. Good morning to you, Mr. Secretary.
Good morning.
Just to remind our audience, you became known nationally in the wake of that election because you refused to succumb to pressure from President Trump when he specifically asked you to, quote, find 11,780 votes. President Biden, of course, won that state by 11,779 votes. Now you're up for re-election, and you are being primaried by a Republican congressman who objected to even certifying the president's victory. I wonder, do you fear that in the future, Republican officials in your state may try to change the outcome of an upcoming election for purely political purposes?
Well, the person I'm running against, Congressman Heiss, he's been in Congress for several years. He's never done a single piece of election reform legislation. Then he certified his own race with those same machines, those same ballots. And yet for President Trump, he said you couldn't trust that. That's a double-minded person. And as a pastor, he should know better. So I'm going to run on integrity, and I'm going to run on the truth. I don't know what he's going to run on.
But to that point, is the level of what's at stake here the possibility that an election outcome in your state could be manipulated?
With the laws that we have in place, there have been concerns raised, but no, the results will be the results, and those will be the results that will be certified. You cannot overturn the will of the people, and so that won't matter, but at the end of the day, I will be reelected and he will not be.
Well, let me ask you about something that the former president claimed this week, which once again, he says there was fraud in Georgia. He said people were being paid $10 for their ballots. I know that asking a third party to drop off your absentee ballot, something called ballot harvesting, is illegal in the state of Georgia. But I wonder, has there been any evidence that any of those ballots were actually fraudulent or cast by ineligible voters?
It is an ongoing investigation. What I can tell you is that we just got that information in November 2021, over a year after the election. So I wish we would have gotten it a whole lot sooner, but we've opened up an investigation. But no one has alleged that those are fraudulent ballots. Those were lawful voters, and that the allegation is that then they were collected and delivered by a person. But that's one thing that I do think we need, is to make sure that nationwide there should be a law that bans, ballot harvesting. I don't think that ballot harvesting is good. The only person that should touch your ballot is you and the election official. So I think that's one solid election reform measure. Number two, I think that we should have a constitutional amendment, a U.S. constitutional amendment that only American citizens vote in our elections. And I think we should have also photo ID. We now have photo ID for all forms of voting in Georgia.
Only U.S. citizens do currently vote in elections, but go on.
But we don't have a constitutional amendment. Now you see cities are trying to push non-citizen voting. And I believe that only American citizens should be voting in our elections. That's supported by a wide variety and wide majority of all Americans, just like photo ID is supported by all demographic groups and a majority of both political parties. And that's what they've been using in Minnesota for over 11 years for their absentee balloting. So that's another, solid common sense federal reform measure if they really want to get serious about election reform.
I assume there you're referring to the president and the vice president who will be traveling to your state in the coming days. They are doing so to campaign for two laws, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act.
Right.
The Freedom to Vote Act actually does promote a national standard for states that have an ID requirement for in-person voting. You could use a bank statement, a utility bill. I wonder, why do you think Republicans...
It does not have photo ID, and photo ID is the most secure way of using and making sure that you can identify who the voter is. And I think that's very important. And then they also want same-day registration. And that's just, very difficult for any election official to manage. And I think that undermines trust in elections. And right now, we need to restore trust wherever we can. In Georgia, we've been fighting this theme of stolen election claims from Stacey Abrams about voter suppression, and then 2020 is about voter fraud. Both of them undermine voter trust.
They may both undermine voter trust, but I'm sure you draw a distinction between someone who doesn't hold any kind of office and the president of the United States actively putting pressure on you to find and manufacture votes. They're not equivalent.
January 6th was terrible, but the response doesn't need to be eliminating photo ID and then having same-day registration. And if you don't have the appropriate guardrails in place, then you're not going to have voter confidence in the results. In Georgia, we've actually increased the number of days of early voting. We have more early voting now than New York, New Jersey, and Delaware.
No, I understand, but when you were talking about Stacey Abrams, I was just acknowledging that there is a difference, that she didn't call on people to attack the state capitol when she was questioning the outcome of the 2018 gubernatorial race.
The president is the top official that we have in our country, and obviously that positional power is just much higher than a candidate running for governor.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, when people lose races, I think the proper thing to do is admit that you lose, and if you want to run again, by all means do so.
Understood. Georgia has a painful past with racial discrimination, and until 2013, states like Georgia had to seek some federal pre-clearance when it came to changing their election laws. I won't get into the details of all of it, but this is one of the provisions that the White House says is so important in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Do you see any merit in the idea that there needs to be more federal oversight in states that have a history of racial discrimination?
Georgia has moved so far ahead. We're not where we were in 1965. And you look at, we have more
But this
early
was in
voting
place
than
until
all these-
2013.
I know. And I think that we have shown that Georgia has fair and honest elections. We have record registrations. We have record turnout. Anyone that wants to vote in Georgia has tremendous opportunities to vote early, vote with no excuse absentee voting, with photo ID, and then also show up on election day. And I'll compare our record against the other state.
Yeah.
In fact, we were just recognized by Heritage as the #1 state for election integrity.
Well, by Heritage, and I think the public will hear a different version when the president goes to your state, and that's why we wanted to talk to you today. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time. And we will go directly now to the director and founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, David Becker. Good morning to you, David.
Good morning, Margaret.
If I want to talk about a number of things, but is there anything there that the secretary laid out that you would like to respond to? I know specifically on voter ID and what he referred to as ballot harvesting, you have some views.
Well, I mean, I think there's room for disagreement in the states on a variety of the administrative policies around elections. How many ballots a third party might be able to deliver from a place like a nursing home, how rigid an ID system has to be, and what kind of fail-safe is there to make sure that eligible voters don't get excluded from voting because they don't happen to have ID. But I think what we're really worried about in this moment in time, right now, because of the lies being spread by the losing presidential candidate, are the efforts to sow confusion and chaos into the vote counting and certification process. That's what I'm really working on and looking at in the states. And it's something I know Secretary Raffensperger and his colleagues, both Republican and Democrat around the country, are looking at.
Mm-hmm. And we mentioned that earlier with the Speaker of the House. But looking nationwide, 25 states enacted 62 laws that expanded voting since 2020. Nearly all of them have Democratic-controlled legislatures. 19 states enacted 34 voting restrictive laws. All of those have GOP-controlled legislatures. When you look at that breakdown, what does this say to you? And when it comes specifically to Georgia, is it really the case that what they have done is Jim Crow on steroids, as President Biden refers to it? Because the Secretary of State there says that's not what he's seeing.
Well, I think what you're seeing, obviously, that's not the sign of a healthy democracy, and our democracy is in crisis right now. I'm as concerned as I've ever been. And certainly in those states where Republicans control majorities in the legislatures, those majorities are being fueled by the lies from the losing presidential candidate of their party. We are now over 400 days after what was by any measure the most secure, transparent, scrutinized, and verified election in American history. More audits of those ballots than ever before, more court scrutiny and verification of the outcomes than ever before, including judges appointed by the losing presidential candidate himself. Mm-hmm. And so in states like Texas, Florida, Arizona, and yes, even Georgia, we see election policy being considered in a way that's not entirely constructive. It is partisan. It's based on some false premises about how well the election was run. The facts are in Georgia and in those other states and throughout the country, the election was run exceedingly well. It's remarkable how well it was run, with resources being scarce, with the highest turnout we've ever seen, and in the middle of a global pandemic. So in Georgia, it's true, compared to most of the other states, Georgia actually has pretty accessible voting policies. But that being said, the legislature removed some powers from Secretary Raffensperger, who he and his staff did a remarkably good job in 2020. They have injected some chaos into the counting and certification process that doesn't need to be there. But in other states like Texas, it's even worse, where the voting laws are much more restrictive and there's even more chaos being injected into the process.
So because of what's happening at the state level, the White House is making the broader argument that there needs to be more federal election law crafted. They are putting their shoulder behind two bills, and we're going to hear from the president in the coming days about the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The White House says these are absolutely essential. They don't have the votes to pass either of them. But on the premise here that there needs to be more federal oversight, do you agree?
I think that there could be some value right now, given the unprecedented attack on our democracy, and the fact that tens of millions of American citizens have been led to believe, fueled by lies, that our system does not have integrity. And just to be clear, we have the most integrity in American elections than we've ever had in American history at this moment in time, and that will continue to grow. But there could be some use for some federal standards. There's a lot of good things in those two bills, but as you noted, it's highly unlikely that either has even 50 votes to pass the Senate. But if there could be a truly bipartisan effort to look at the crisis issues in our democracy and try to find ways to resolve them so that we don't have confusion and chaos in the post-election period, that the person who gets the most votes is declared the winner under systems that are transparent, that would be really good.
So one of the ideas that was floated in the past week was trying to update the Electoral Count Act. So that's something that even some of the Democrats on the January 6th committee, including Congresswoman Lofgren, had supported updating that kind of arcane law, which was at the heart of some of the premise of disputing January 6th. But both the vice president and the Senate minority leader both really shot that down this week. In fact, Senator Schumer said clarifying the Electoral Count Act is a distraction. And so this is a quote. It's sort of like saying, well, I'm going to rig the game, but then I will make sure you count the score accurately. What the hell is the point if you rig the game to count the score accurately? Were you surprised to hear that kind of language from the Democratic leader? And should it be reformed, the Electoral Count Act?
Yeah, well, there's obviously a lot of politics being played right now in terms of getting whatever bills that can be passed moved in the next year as we enter the midterm elections. But I agree with many experts and members of both parties that it'd be good to clarify and revise the Electoral Count Act of 1887 rather, and to make it clear that the joint session of Congress is purely a ceremonial session. They are just counting the votes. It's really like the Oscars. They're not voting on who won Best Picture. They're just announcing who won Best Picture.
Exactly.
And similarly, that's what the joint session is, and I think that'd be really valuable.
Exactly. Thank you, David Becker, for your perspective, as always. We'll be back in a moment. That is it for us today. Thank you all for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.